Thank you so much, Mai. And I want to apologize here at the start. I just want to make sure everybody can see my screen and that we're good. My voice might sound a little bit deeper. It's just because recently I had a cold and I'm overcoming that, so I apologize in advance for the baritone in my voice. But I'm happy and excited to be here with all of you today. Um, we're going to talk today about proficiency in practice, real world strategies for assessing growth. And before we get started, I just want to invite you all to put in the chat, a little bit about yourselves, what state you're from, what language and level you're teaching. I always find that very interesting because you guys have in the past, just it's from all over. I know we've had people from all over the states here with us too, so I always just a little curious to see who's here. Um, yeah, so if you'll do that, I do want to take a moment and start by just saying how thankful I am for all of you for the work you do. I never will tire of Again, first of all, saying thank you to all of you for, I know it's a lot. Myself, I've been an educator for many years. My wife is a current Spanish teacher, so I'm from a teacher family. I know all about that. And so I just want to make sure that, that you guys know that we appreciate you and all that you do. So let's take a moment. Let me see if I can see the chat here. Hang on. All right. Yeah, this over here. Okay. But yeah, okay, great. Well, I'm glad that you're all here with us. Thank you for sharing a little bit about yourselves. Today, our topic, like I said, is going to be talking about proficiency and talking about how we can do that. Thank you, everyone. North Carolina, Oklahoma. Okay, awesome. Well, so I've already told you a little bit about myself, but I'll start again and say that I am a strategic relationship specialist with Cletwell Languages. Prior to that, I served 25 years as a German teacher in Georgia. I taught all levels, kindergarten through 12th grade. My first job was a K-5 job, which I very much loved and learned a lot doing it. I also learned to play the guitar because when you're working with children, music was really important. So I really love that. I'm a Teacher of the Year twice, and 2013 AATG Teacher of the Year here for Georgia. I worked at the state levels for 6+ years, supporting world language and DLI programs in Georgia. And yeah, so I'm also married, like I said, to a wonderful Spanish teacher, Maria, and I have 4 boys, all of them 23 and above now, because that puts me in a certain age bracket, and that's okay. But yeah, so that's a little bit about me, and let's roll into what we got to talk about because we got a little bit of time, and there's a definitely some things I want to bring across here. So our topic for today is what is proficiency-based instruction? We're going to start there. And then we're going to move into the difference between performance assessments and traditional assessments. And then you might phrase it another way by saying assessing for proficiency versus grading. There's definitely two different things. And I think we do a good job of maybe grading, but not always a good job of assessing for proficiency. And there's a lot of reasons for that. So today we're going to talk about the difference, but also try to give you some tips and takeaways for you to think about how you can incorporate more proficiency-based performance assessments in what you're doing. And that's one of the things actually I very much love about our products here at Cletwell Languages is we do a great job of building these assessments into our programs. And so the work is done in a lot of ways, IPAs and otherwise, project-based assessments as well. So we'll talk about all that. But anyway, it's delightful to be able to speak with all of you about this today. And I'm thankful for all of you for being here because I know your time is valuable. So we're going to talk and start with this question, beyond the grade, what are we really measuring? So in our school environments, we're required to give a grade, right? So we give that, and as part of that grade, there's a lot of elements that are not necessarily tied to proficiency, things like attendance or completion of task participation in some ways. So we need to really start by thinking about, and I want you to just think about this. You don't have to necessarily type it in the chat or anything like that, but think about to the extent to which the following statement is true for you. In my class, I'm grading collecting points, averages, busy work, but not truly assessing and gathering information about proficiency. And then a secondary kind of follow-up question to that is, what are some obstacles to assessing for proficiency? Now, here you can put in the chat what your thoughts are. When we think about assessing for proficiency, you might think, well, that does take some time. So maybe that's an obstacle for you. I know that time is always seems like under attack in some ways in our classrooms, like because there's all kinds of interruptions. But you know, when we talk about and assessing for proficiency, what are the obstacles you're facing? So we've all seen this chart, this cone from ACTFL. Um, I want to start by just defining for a minute what language proficiency is. Language proficiency is the ability to use language to accomplish communication objectives. And those two that I've bolded and underlined are the most important pieces in my mind. The ability to use language, not just tell about language, but how to use language in real world simulations or things that are really relevant. So, and you have objectives that are can-do statements. We have a lot of can-do statements, but they are communication oriented. They are where we are getting something across, whether it's in writing or reading or least listening or speaking in those four domains. And last year, when we did this series for FFLA, I did a whole seminar on, or one of these webcast on the fact, just the facts, ma'am. I actually called it. Is it the four criteria: functions and task, accuracy, context and content, and text type? And so I'm going to kind of revisit that in a much smaller way today. But when we talk about language proficiency, these are the things that I'm thinking about. So, what language proficiency really measures is the ability to use language to accomplish communication objectives. And we do this across, four domains, but we also do it through these key areas of assessment, functions and task. What can they do with the language? How well do they do it? That's the accuracy. Where can they do it? And in what context? And then how complex is their language? And I believe in our last webcast, which might actually be available, the FFLA has recordings, or maybe we as CLAT has recordings. We talked about how we looked at actually specifically the Florida um, uh, objectives, and we broke those down into those facts. We looked at each of the main objectives, and we broke it down. So we kind of used that last year. Um, so what is proficiency-based instruction? Well, proficiency-based instruction is an approach to world language instruction that builds learners' language proficiency through meaningful classroom performances, emphasizing authentic communication and anchored in the world readiness standards for learning languages. So key things here are meaningful for the learners, and authentic. It means using authentic materials, but it also means the situations that we're asking students to use language in are themselves authentic and relevant, not some contrived event that could not happen or hypothetical. I mean, these are kind of mirrored around real world context. And what I really love about our products as well is the integration of the AP themes and of the AP key areas. And you'll see the recycling of vocabulary and the spiraling of vocabulary throughout that. That's because as you move up in proficiency, you can still encounter the same context, but maybe at a higher level. So I really like that recycling, or if you think about it as a spiral approach to vocabulary and themes within the context of a whole series, like the Reporters series. So, what is proficiency-based instruction? Well, it's using language to interact, interpret, and present in real-world communication. So, in real-world context. It's goal-oriented, it has can-do statements, it has proficiency targets, It's meaningful input, meaning the input that we're giving learners is authentic audios and visuals and text. And then it's performance tasks, tasks like role plays and real life scenarios that where we're actually required to use language in. And then where our proficiency assessment is really what students can do with the language. It's not telling us, so many of our assessments, I guess, in the world language classroom are sort of summative, like, they're more like a text based, or can you do this? Can you conjugate this verb? Or at least in the past, it's been that way, and less geared more toward giving students the feedback they need to increase their proficiency. So, again, kind of to summarize, what learners can do with language in real world context. Grammar and vocabulary are still very important, but they're used as tools for meaning making. They're embedded in the context of communication. So I really love the approach that is more where communication is the goal and everything else flows toward making that communication possible. And you and I know that in order, depending upon what our can do statement is, students might not need to know all the grammar. They need, the full picture of it. They just need enough to be able to complete the communication. And I know I have four boys, as I mentioned, and many of you have perhaps children as well. And when you watch children acquire language, they're acquiring a lot, but they're learning it because it has context, because they also want to communicate something. So it is very much communication based. And it mirrors how humans acquire language, is my point. It's authentic, comprehensible input. It's using language to meet our needs, and it's refined through feedback. So, as children get their feedback from their parents about how to say a word or in what context to use it, it's the same when we're teaching students about using language. I'm going to pause to take a drink here. It's refined through that feedback. Okay. So when we look at, if we think, we're a big proponents of a backward design concept. So, and what's great about, I think, in the sense of World Language Materials specifically, is they were designed with communication as the goal, as the forward thinking. So everything is backward designed from that principal goal instead of trying to reverse engineer something that was created, not necessarily for that context, but then to try to put band-aids on it or put something on it to make it fit. And our materials are all created in the last 3 years or so, so they're very new. And the benefit of that is when this new approach came to actually apply this from the very beginning of a textbook. So if you backward design, you think about what you want as your desired results. We want students to use language. So we determine what would be acceptable evidence of that. And those are our assessment tasks. And that's why a lot of the assessment tasks that you'll see are, listening, they're involving the three modes. They're a combination of the three modes, maybe with an IPA, or they're project based, where students have to kind of incorporate what they've learned. And it's really important when you look at those things we're asking kids to do that they're not too rigidly defined, because the nature of language is if we want them to communicate a can-do statement. I want to be able to talk about my family. They will get all that, but we don't want to too structurally define them and limit them. We want them to show us the full range of what they're capable of. So if our end goal is proficiency, what students can actually do with language, then our assessment and instruction should flow from that goal. So that's why it's really important to think about what your goal is. So if our goal is in our materials that students will use language, then what follows from that is our instruction is going to have that as its center, and our assessments will also mirror that goal. And that's what I'm saying about how important it is to create something with this context in the beginning. Because when you have that as your beginning, you're able to create a whole program with that focus. And I'll say a word here too about, even though grammar is presented in context, there is always those charts at the end of each chapter to kind of help flesh out grammar in a more detailed way. But for the purpose of what we're asking kids to do in a specific task or for a specific assignment, we're really just focusing in on what is the language and context and grammar they need to accomplish that task. And we're not going to go too far beyond that, at least in terms of focusing on what the goal is. Okay. So proficiency-based assessments are if the goals of communicative proficiency-oriented curricula are not the goals of traditional tests. And that's where I go back to what I was talking about at the beginning. Traditional tests don't always have communicative proficiency as their goal. They are, and I've given lots of summative tests where I've asked kids to conjugate verbs and then write sentences with that back when I was a beginning teacher. And I think about that, and that was kind of based on the old method. And I might be dating myself, but I will say I'm more than 3 decades old in education now at this point. But when I first started teaching, I knew that this communicative approach was not really necessarily had reached its, you know, we haven't reached that point 3 decades ago, but I'm glad that we're there now because when I reflect on the way that I taught, it wasn't that it was wrong. It was just that I was focusing more and talking about language instead of trying to get students to use language. And one thing that follows from that is if we want students to use language, then as teachers, we have to use language too. And my previous webinar to this was about how we could give some tips on how you could stay in the target language because it's so important when we are teachers that specifically in my case, in German, they weren't going to run into German outside of my classroom typically. So I was the sole provider of input for them. And, it's important then as teachers that we take on that responsibility of trying to be, trying to incorporate as much language as we can so that students will have a better chance of being able to acquire it. It's not only just using language, but making it comprehensible. And of course, that's a whole nother topic. And I'm sure you guys are to some degree familiar about that because you probably heard it before. So performance assessments motivate learners to show what they know and can do. And that's where it's different from a more traditional assessment. Unlike in a traditional assessment, they may focus on the recall of grammar structures or vocabulary, not always in context. So, I can remember, when I first started teaching, there were lots of ways to approach, for example, vocabulary might be matching or could be just you had a multiple choice. Those were always easier to grade. So we kind of fell back on that a lot. But performance assessments are really those assessments that allow students to use language. And today, I really hope to kind of persuade you to the point that you should incorporate performance assessments as much as you can in what you're doing, because I think that's where we're really getting students to use language, not just tell us what they know about it, but use it. And the more that students use language, the more it will stick in their minds. And that's really important. Proficiency oriented mindset says, we want students to show us how they can use language, not just tell us what they know about language. And it's backward design again. A communicative classroom needs a communicative assessment. So if we have communication as our goal, then our assessments need to reflect that communication. So my challenge to you might be is if, when you think about your exams or your summative evaluations, even your, formative evaluations, try to think about how can we build in more performance assessments for students, asking them to use what they have learned. And again, I will say that it's incumbent upon us as educators to use the language ourselves. All right. So if we put these in kind of a chart, and I just did this kind of today as a way to kind of clear it in my mind, I hope it helps you. And I'm going to keep revisiting this because sometimes I feel like I want to show it in many different contexts to get the point across. But assessments demonstrate what learners can do with the language. They don't just check on recall of vocabulary and grammar. The tasks that we're asking students to do in performance assessments need to be relevant, they need to be real world, and they need to be purposeful. And they need to be topics and things, tasks that students would be interested in. Instead of discrete items, fill in the blank, conjugation, matching, which I mentioned earlier. We like to try to integrate across the modes or incorporate more than one mode if we can, especially in an IPA where all of those are part of it. And then a lot of times in traditional tests, these might be single skills that are not always connected or in context, might be presented in isolation. The feedback on performance assessments is rubrics that are tied to descriptors, proficiency descriptors. Again, we go back to the facts, the functions, the text type, the comprehensibility. Whereas traditional tests, might deduct errors for slight grammatical mistakes. And the focus is more on accuracy instead of meaning making. And all of this leads to an instructional impact, right? Because if we're using performance assessments, what we're really driving at is communication. Whereas traditional tests, it might pull you more back into drills and memorization. So I'm trying again to paint this picture of what's the difference. And I created this little chart too. Maybe it's helpful, but it kind of talks about what learners can do with the language versus check. And I've kind of reintegrated these in a visual. But our goal with performance assessments ultimately is proficiency, increasing proficiency and growth. We want them to provide evidence of learning. We want them to provide evidence that their proficiency is increasing. And we all know that proficiency is developed over time and it kind of spans, and it's not the same for everyone. I just mentioned, four different, much different categories here. So, you might be good at reading and less good at speaking, and that's typically the case, or even writing. But the development across all these skills ultimately leads them to become better users of the language. And our goal as teachers is not only to give students a grade, but also to try to increase their proficiency. Of course, there's much more that we do in the world language classroom that we all know that is super important, right? We give a lot of context to the world. I always felt like my classroom was that place where they better understood English. I'll say it and I'll say it again until I die. When students learn a second language, their first second language, it really helps them understand their native language. And in many ways, too, I would say that until they have deeply encountered another culture and language, they don't fully always understand their own because they have nothing to compare it to. So I think going back to performance assessments, this is what we really want. We want real life application. We want to be able to use it in the real world. So let's a quick note about assessing for proficiency versus grading again. Assessing for proficiency measures what students can do with the language, describes their performance in real world tasks or tasks that are very close to real world scenarios. It can show growth, it can show their progress, and the feedback that they get is descriptive. It's more feedback that's designed to try to focus in on one area, and we'll talk about some feedback here that areas you can think about how to give feedback that will help your kids in terms of their proficiency. Um, Whereas grading, that varies by teacher and by school. Sometimes, schools have different setups, what they require you to put in your syllabus or whatever is asked by the district. It summarizes performance. It might include non-linguistic factors like things that are not related to language instruction at all. So assessing for proficiency is really the pure form of that. And that's what's really great about this scale that we have from ACTFL. And of course, on the ILR scale is if you're familiar with Europe as well, is that proficiency is measurable and we have a set scale for that. And it doesn't vary by school, doesn't vary by district because we're talking about language here and language is holistic. It's not determined by a district or even a state or even a country. So that's what's really important. So assessment for proficiency focuses on what students can do with the language in real world context. And I think that's about as succinct as I can make it. And grading is more the act of assigning a score or a mark that goes into the grade book. It's a reporting tool, but not a learning tool. And that's a really important, I might underline and bold that the next time I present on this. But grading is a reporting tool, not necessarily a learning tool. And it's not necessarily a proficiency tool in that regard. If we start, therefore, with proficiency as our desired result, and we align everything, our curriculum, our task, and our assessments by that, then we need to ask, are we really gathering evidence of proficiency or are we just recording grades? So when you have proficiency as your goal, everything's going to align behind that as much as possible. And of course, we all have to work within our individual frameworks. But we're not just giving grades. We are trying to move students further down the path and understanding their own proficiency, but also giving them encouragement and things to aim for to increase their proficiency. And I think one of the struggles we have as teachers in language classroom, honestly, sometimes just understanding that difference and then finding the time and the methods that we can use to really get to that issue. And I think it does take practice. If we're so used to the old one that it's hard to make that switch sometimes to assessing proficiency. But that's where I think the materials can really help you out, because if the materials are geared with that at the beginning, it's easier for you to go toward proficiency rather than trying to put that on something that wasn't created with that in mind. So let's talk about, if we want students to do something with language, we should design assessments that reflect real communication, and we need to provide comprehensible, meaningful input to prepare them. And that's really important, right? It's because, I know probably there's some crashing fans, but everybody understands that if language is going to be acquired, it needs to be understood. It needs to be comprehensible. And that's a really fundamental part of that communication aspect as well. That's why it's really important that we as teachers use language in our classroom, but not only using language for the sake of using language, but making that language comprehensible so that our students can acquire it. And what's beautiful about a well put together curriculum is that as you go into a chapter and you learn about these things and it builds, when you get to those summative evaluations, they're well prepared to complete that task because of everything they've done before. And that's what I really love about a well built and tied together curriculum, and not something that's kind of hodgepodge together. So the limitations of grading only are pretty probably obvious to many of you. If I don't assess what students can do with language, I can't tell where they're at. So if you can't assess for proficiency, you really have no way of knowing where your students are at. And then if I don't know where they're at, how can I help them get to where they want to go? And if I don't know their level, I can't give them feedback, like I'm saying, or I can't design instruction that helps them progress. So it's really important, not only from the standpoint of when we talk for kids using language, but also that when they use it, that gives us the opportunity to assess where they're at. And from that, we can really start to refine where we want them to go. So grading without assessing or reporting numbers without moving students forward on the proficiency pathway, they don't get the feedback they need to grow. So when you think about your classroom, think about, well, I'm giving them a grade, but am I really giving them the feedback they need to progress in their proficiency as a language? Our goal is, of course, for them to get to the proficiency level to use language for the seal of biliteracy. They have to demonstrate they can use the language and understand it. So really, when we think about it from this context, excuse me, I'm gonna take a drink here. Assessing is feedback for learning. Wow, that really changed my voice. That's helpful. Assessing is feedback for learning. That's what it is. So if we want to really assess students, we have to give them feedback. And that feedback is going to help them progress in a language. Um, and that's really important. So types of proficiency-based assessments. So we're going to kind of go through these a little bit. And you probably heard about these before. There are summative and formative assessments that can be aligned to the proficiency-based approach. So if we have proficiency communication as our goal, then what kinds of summative and formative assessments would you see in a curriculum that has that as its focus? Well, you're likely to see many what we call RAFT tasks. So RAFT is where that's an acronym for role, audience, format, and topic. So, who is the learner pretending to be? A traveler, a friend, a student, a customer, a journalist? Audience, who are they communicating with? So, we establish all these in the different scenarios and tasks and assessments we're asking them to do. We're giving them the role, we're giving them the audience. Who are you communicating with? A host family, a classmate, community group, a younger student, or social media. Format, what type of communication are they producing? Is it a message, a video, a dialogue, a brochure? There's many different ways to communicate. It's not all verbal. In fact, I think a lot of comprehensible input, a lot of times we think as teachers, yes, we have to use the language, but it's not just about us using the language. It's about students reading in the language. That's why reading is so important. And that's why I love the readers that are aligned to the proficiency levels in our books. So you don't have to go out and find readers that are appropriate for the proficiency level of your book, of your students. It's already there and created. That's what I talk about it being a complete curriculum in that regard, because not only does it have this communicative approach from the outset, but the readers are part of that. Everything that's created begins with that backward design thinking of, all right, we're going to start with communication as our goal, and everything is aligned beyond that. And then topic, what is the topic? Are you giving advice? Are you describing a problem? Are you comparing opinions or options? So type topic aligns directly with proficiency functions. So you have also role plays. You'll see a lot of that in our materials. You see projects and presentations, mini projects, a summative project, and you'll see IPAs. But what's also there is also some of that other stuff that you've traditionally been doing all this time as well. So I think it's a good balance. It provides that communicative focus as an outset, but has plenty of grammar as well embedded in the charts at the end of the chapter to help flesh out some of that stuff, which is really important. So, a typical format is a learner is presented with a prompt or a situation, and they use their knowledge and skills, which they have been gaining, to address the question or situation using any combination of the three modes of communication. So that is a typical format for a proficiency-based assessment. Again, it's a prompt or situation. They use what they have learned to give an answer or to provide or to create a project or to complete some task. And it's going to normally involve an integration of several different modes. For example, this is just a mini project derived from our reporters series, but it's talking about my circle. So the assessment has to hit the right balance. It can't too define the task as to define exactly what grammar structures they use and exactly what language. All of that is implied because they have been already using all those structures and using and learning that language. But rather, it talks about more what is the task you want them to complete, and then it gives them some basic guidelines to do it. But it's kind of understood that they're going to use what they have learned to create that task or to complete it. Here you can visualize some examples of different types of proficiency based assessments that are in our books. Of course, I talked about, what we saw from left to right, projects like an IPA exam with all three modes in one exam, all supporting the same context, or even taking a task from a class practice and turning it into an assessment. In the third image on this screen, you'll see different school systems is the communicative objective. That's the can-do statement. The students read the school schedules of three different students from three different countries and write a paragraph comparing them, and then ultimately write about which country they would choose to live in and why. And it combines a lot of the different modes we're talking about: interpretive reading, presentational, and you can always collect something like this in class for a proficiency-based formative assessment. This seems straightforward, but it's easy to fall back into traditional assessments. That's why it's so important to have products that are designed with this in mind already, so that it kind of makes it easier to incorporate more proficiency-based assignments in your language class. The goal is to teach students ultimately to use language. The assessment that you choose is what defines what using looks like. So in one assessment, a using might be, where we're talking about our circle of friends, or it might be describing a school system, whatever that looks like. But you can see for these examples of how the creators have really thought about how can we incorporate assessments that are holistic in nature, yet connected to everything they've learned in terms of those can-do statements we had at the beginning. Again, very communicatively focused, focused, and everything is backward designs from that. So, what are the classroom implications of communicative assessments? Well, we've kind of alluded to this. I kind of alluded to this earlier. Students must hear and use the language regularly. That's one of the things that is an implication of that. Yeah, the more that students hear and use the language, the better they will get at doing both. The better they will get at acquiring language, but also not only acquiring it, but using it for purposes, for communicative, real world purposes. Teachers should design routines and activities that kind of build these skills. So that's where it's really important to have a curriculum that is designed in this way so that you don't have to create that on your own. It's already embedded in the thinking of the curriculum, which is really important. And what's really important too is that both groups must use the target language consistently so students are prepared for the performance task. So, and we've talked about that, how in our previous webinar, how to use target language and some tips for getting kids to use language. And if you want to go back and view that, you get a more comprehensive explanation that I gave about that. But essentially, as teachers, we control ourselves. We don't control kids all the time, but we can definitely create the environment where we're asking kids and giving them the instructional supports they need so that they can use language. And the key with that is to give kids plenty of support and scaffolding so that they will be more comfortable to do that. And the more they do this, of course, the more comfortable they become with it. And that's really important too. I remember I had two different experiences. One experience where I started in a very communicatively focused class that was later in my career. In the beginning, I was as a German teacher, I was in love with German grammar. I know that sounds weird, but like, oh, but I mean, I wanted to know the mechanics of a language. But in that context, I didn't really use language a lot in the classroom. And I felt like my kids, they might understand the structures, but they never really understood all the time how to use it. And I feel like I failed my students in some way in that regard because I didn't put the impetus on them using the language when I first started. But when I switched schools, I had the opportunity to kind of think things and do things. And I'm very proud of myself for the fact that I went to a very communicative approach and used the target language consistently and required kids to do more of that. I still didn't have a great curriculum like CLEP, for example, at that time. So I was still creating a lot of things myself, and that took time and that took effort. But my point is, if we can get closer to that communicative classroom, we're going to serve our students better. We're going to get them further down the proficiency pathway so that they'll be able to get that seal of biliteracy in Florida, so that they'll be able to become not only understanders of language, which is really important in its own way, but users of it and seeing that they can be successful in the use of that language to communicate. And of course, like anything, practice makes perfect. So the more we practice this communicative approach, the easier it gets for us as educators. So if we modify things for proficiency goals, we often don't see any specific grammar structures mentioned. The grammar structures they need to complete what they're asked to do has been practiced prior to the assessment, but it's not specifically laid out like you must use. five sentences in the present tense, you must use three conjugations. And, that could be you in an old test, a traditional test, you might take off, or if they didn't use that enough or they didn't use this tense. The goal in communicative proficiency assignments is that they use language and they relate meaning through that use. So there's often no specific vocabulary that students are asked to incorporate, but relevant vocabulary has been presented to them so they can use what they have learned. And that also includes anything that they might have learned outside or from a previous level. For example, especially in level 2 and 3 and 4, students have acquired a little bit more language, so they have a little more depth to their understanding of different subjects. So language is not meant to be limited. It is a free-flowing river. So if we want to put students in the role of actually using language like it exists in the world, we have to kind of give them the freedom to really use everything in their repertoire and not sort of single them into different specific channels, if you will. And there's a holistic rubric that's often used instead of a specific rubric when it comes to grading these. The prompt is written in a way to naturally elicit that language, but the primary focus is on meaning and communication. I'm gonna help you by taking another drink. So the so in other words, the prompt is is going to elicit all these things, the grammar structures and the vocabulary. But the primary focus is really on communication. What is it? And if they get that communication across. So how can we assess efficiently without sacrificing quality of feedback? And that's a really important question because if we're talking about proficiency-based assessments, then we have to ask ourselves, how can we assess that efficiently without involving too much of our time as teachers? So here's some time-saving tips. You could pick a focus area or a priority area, whether it be for this written or for this verbal production. I'm going to focus more on your use of specific things, whether it's connection, the connectors you're using, or the cohesion, or if you're getting your point across. Some teachers develop correction codes for common mistakes. That helps to kind of synthesize so you're not having to give a lot. You can even be very simple and say, this is one thing you did well. This is one thing to improve on next time. So if they create that project like we saw on the previous slide, I can focus in on one thing they did well. I can give them that feedback. And then I can focus in on one area where I think they can improve on. So the feedback is really specific and at the same time, not too detailed, but it's giving them what they need essentially to improve. Rubrics are really good in this regard. Feedback banks as well are really good about this. And if you have, and we have self and peer assessments that where students can self-assess and also assess one another or give feedback to one another, that's a really powerful thing as far as increasing proficiency. Because when you do get that kind of interaction in your classroom where not only you're giving feedback, but kids are giving feedback to each other about ways to improve. And isn't that a natural way to improve anyway? We get feedback and we make the adjustments, and the next time we make those adjustments, we do better. So these are all kind of, I think, almost self-explanatory. I don't want you to think about proficiency assessment as something that has to be very complex. Again, it can be very simple, but it's related to what they're producing. So the takeaways. In world language classes, proficiency is our target. Backward design gives us kind of the roadmap to get to that target. If we want communicative classes, if we want classes where students use language, then our assessments also need to assess the use of language, not just their understanding of language, but how they're using your language. I hope you kind of see that's really the crux of what we're talking about. Because we want, students quickly realize that what we assess is what really matters to us and to them too. So if we're just assessing what they know, it doesn't really encourage them to progress into proficiency. We have to also assess how they use language. World language assessment is not the same as points on a grade, right? We've already talked about that. There are a lot of things in a grade that are not necessarily tied to their proficiency, but it gives us evidence. What we're looking for with world language assessments is really evidence of what students can do with the language. And performance assessment is about giving students feedback on progress toward those proficiency targets, whatever they may be. And the better that kids understand this in some ways, the better they can also sort of navigate it. But we are the professionals. We are the ones with the training. So it's really important for us to really think about all these things in the context of what can we do in our classes that will help that. And I think if you come away from this webinar today and your goal is, you know what, Patrick, I hear what you're saying. I am going to try to incorporate some more activities where students are required to use the language, then I will feel good because I think the more we can get students using language in tasks that are relevant to them and also relevant to their lives, and if we can give them good feedback on an assessment on their use of the language, feedback that helps move them forward and up that proficiency scale, then that's really where we want to go. And the more that we do that, the more they will progress and the better and better it will be for all involved. So I know that there are a lot of challenges to teachers, believe me, I know that. But this is something I believe that is fundamental to us. We want students to use language. And again, I know that there's so much that happens in a world language classroom beyond even understanding of the use of language, just being to think about the world as, uh, occurring simultaneously in many different contexts. So many times it's really important for kids to know these days.
But yeah, I just wanted to say thank you to both of you and to Colette for this webinar and for the opportunity to just remind everyone that FFLA, the Florida Foreign Language Association, um, we're kind of doing this a little bit in partnership with CLET, and our conference is going to be held this October. I put the link to our website in the chat, which has information, the dates of the conference, the location. It's in Daytona Beach. So if anyone is up north and wants a little weekend vacation to the beach in Florida in October, that might be something fun for you to do. And obviously, we're looking forward to having Colette there. We don't have tickets up yet, but we do have the link for submitting a proposal if anyone's interested in presenting. We love to hear, the strategies that are working in classrooms. Um, so, please feel free to take a look at that. And yeah, thank you so much for doing this.